If you're new to this series, my name is Taylor Goodwin. I am the Safe and Healthy Schools Coordinator for the Vermont Agency of Education. Today we are on, I think, part 7 of our 10-part series that New Solutions is putting on, giving us some great information around budgeting. Today is going to be a little bit of a shift from the series that we've done before. Nate and his team at New Solutions are really going to focus in on best communications or best practices around communications and good strategies for communications around budgeting. So Nate, I will turn it over to you and your team.
Great afternoon, everybody. Very excited to be back. If you're new, very excited that you're joining us. As Taylor shared, the first 7 sessions really focused on a more technical financial side of, hey, what is the best possible way to use the dollars you have? But we know from having talked to so many of you that once you've created a really good budget, very thoughtful, you've balanced the needs of kids and taxpayers, and you've got a plan, a budget that makes a lot of sense, then a whole new set of challenges. And I know it's not easy to get to that place where you have a budget that makes a lot of sense and balances the needs of everybody. But once you have that, there's a whole nother set of challenges. And that's, how do you get your board, your staff, your community to both understand the budget, to appreciate the hard decisions you made, and ultimately to support it. And what we've heard from an awful lot of school and district leaders across Vermont is that they feel they've made some really good headway through the years in being able to thoughtfully design a really good budget, and yet getting folks to support it in some communities has been pretty difficult. So we're going to spend 3 sessions on that aspect of it. So your budget's built. How do we get folks to support it and maybe even thank you for all the great work you've done? So with that, I'm going to share my screen and walk you through, and I think it's worth sharing that there's been an enormous amount of research done in the last 5 years or so on this very topic. So excited to share what the research has shown can help build that support. And so today we're going to really focus on how do you talk about the budget. Tomorrow we will talk about how do you gain even more people to support it. And then lastly, we will share with you a PowerPoint template for that ever-dreaded budget presentation to the public and to the board. And we've actually created a sample template that might be helpful to some of you. But today we're going to focus on how do you talk about the budget, both publicly, privately, during that presentation, and any other time. Again, we will take your questions and get back to you with answers in writing, and then also a frequently asked question document will be posted. So if you do have questions, please take a picture of this QR code, and you'll be able to submit your questions for us to respond. We'll also be hosting office hours to talk to folks who want to continue the conversation as well. And I think this just says it, as a former superintendent, this picture really resonates with me. This is people saying, thank you, Nate, for that very thoughtful budget you built, for the hours you spent weighing all the trade-offs and ultimately coming up with what was good for everybody. I'm being a little facetious. People don't always say thank you for navigating tight financial times. So we need to think about, how do we earn that support, and don't assume they will support us just because we actually built a really good budget. We want to make this a bit more interactive because we've made this session a little bit longer. So for folks who are watching, if you snap this QR code on your phone, you'll be taken to a poll. So if folks would take a few seconds now to take this simple poll, but you will need this QR code, and you can see, oops, why am I not advancing? And you can see the QR code up in the left hand of my screen as well. So here's the question. Love folks, everybody in the room to take the poll. On a scale of 1 to 5, how would you rate your own communication skills related to talking about the budget? 5 being communicate about the budget very clearly. 1 on the other side, hey, that I kind of struggle a bit. Great, and I do love this. So we're seeing in real time, mostly 3s and 4s, a few 5s, and a few on the other side of the spectrum. So about most common being about in the middle. Appreciate that candor. Average score 3.5. And I appreciate, because it is hard to talk about the budget. So this is, I think, a pretty honest sense of where the world is probably at. Only a few folks are 100%. I communicate very clearly. Because one of the things that the research in the last 5 years has shown, and let me go to the next slide, is that many school and district leaders generally consider themselves decent communicators about the budget. Now, maybe not perfect, but pretty solid. But the research overwhelmingly, and this is no insult to anybody, but the research overwhelmingly suggests that staff and taxpayers don't often understand the budget presentation or the discussion of the budget. And it's not that they're just confused, they're actually doubtful. So the I don't understand or believe half of what they just said is a surprisingly common reaction to folks who just sat through a 45-minute presentation on the budget. They don't understand it, which means they're kind of confused and uncertain. And what's even more problematic is they don't believe us. And mind you, I don't believe anybody is lying or misleading or being intentionally unclear. But there's something that happens when folks who consider themselves decent communicators get in front of a group of people to talk about the budget, and some very large portion of folks leave thinking, I don't understand or believe half of what they just said. Now, one thing I'm going to ask you to do, and you are free to reject my advice, but I'm going to ask you to believe me that most people are overestimating how good a communicator they are about the budget. And we're going to talk you through in the next 30 minutes or so, why is it that pretty decent communicators end up leaving people in this state of not understanding or not believing half of what they just said. So because there is definitely a disconnect here, and I'm hoping today we can explain why that disconnect happens and some very practical steps to remove that disconnect. Oops. The other question I just wanted to get folks to weigh in on, it'll help me as I'm going through this presentation. Again, new poll, QR code, is you think about what's been your greatest challenge you've faced when communicating about the budget? Is it that there's misinformation, people are misunderstanding or spreading misinformation, trouble getting in front of the folks you want, there's too much information out there, or they fully understand what you're saying, but their priorities and your priorities might be different? Give folks a minute. Clearly misinformation, pretty high on the list. Trouble reaching the right audiences, also high on the list. Information overload, fairly small, and the differing priorities even smaller yet. But the misinformation seems to be at the top of that. Very, very helpful. And as we go through this session, I will circle back to that misinformation issue. So when we think about what did the research teach us about the best practices for talking about the budget, there really are 3 that we're going to talk about today. The first is the importance and power of telling a story rather than presenting a budget. The second is how important it is to choose your words carefully. And third is the need to build trust and show empathy, not just numbers, as we're having these budget discussions. Let's unpack each of the three. This is not a metaphor. So I want to be really clear that this is actually a recommendation. If you're the superintendent, central office person, or even a principal or the school business official, and you are preparing for a budget presentation to the school board, to a public group, or maybe a group of teachers at a school, before you go and present your budget, before you go and make your PowerPoint, I really would encourage you to explain your budget to a friend at lunch. Here's what I mean by that, and here's why I'm strongly recommending it. If you went to lunch, this is not with an employee of the school system. This is not with somebody who is deeply embedded in the world of education. This is just a community member, somebody you know and who likes you. And if you're at lunch, here's what you won't have in front of you. You will not have a 100-page budget. You will not have a 50-slide PowerPoint. You will have only what's in your head. And if you bring a 100-page budget or a PowerPoint to lunch, shame on you. But so imagine you are sitting at this table, having a burger, and you had to explain your budget to a friend. You wouldn't just quote number after number. You wouldn't be reading lines from an Excel spreadsheet or from a state tax report. What you would do is you would organize your thinking something like this. You might say, hey, this is going to be a really hard budget for us. And then you would probably explain the 3 or 4 reasons it's going to be a hard budget. You might say, hey, we've got declining enrollment. We've lost a lot of kids through the years. Health insurance costs are going up. Well, they've gone up every year for the last 4 years. You would explain the big things that really drove your budget. And you would probably explain it without a ton of numbers. I suspect you would have no decimal points in what you're saying. You might say, health insurance has, gone up 25% over the last few years. But you would be explaining to them the situation. Then I suspect you would probably tell them some of the areas in which if you had to trim, you'd say, it's really terrible, but we're actually losing an instructional coach. We're going to lose a behavior expert. We had to consolidate a couple first grade classrooms, so our class sizes are up. You would explain to them the 2 or 3 big shifts you had to make. Because this is Vermont, I suspect you're going to, before dessert comes, you're going to explain what's happening to taxes. You can say, hey, the tax rate is going to go up, 6 or 7%, for the typical house in our community, that could be $500 or $200. You would hit all the high points. You would not focus on very specific numbers, but just a handful of the most important numbers. And I bet you that by the time you're paying for this check, the person you had lunch with could probably go home and tell a friend, whoa, I feel sorry for Nate. He's got a really tough budget, health insurance. They could explain back the 2 or 3 most important points as to why it was a tough budget and the decisions you made. And in so many ways, when you are presenting a budget in a more formal way, where you will have a PowerPoint, you will have more numbers, but what you're really hoping to accomplish is that the people in the audience understand the big points. They don't need to memorize every number. And so I know this seems like I'm being glib, but I will tell you as somebody who has presented a budget many, many times, I actually do invite friends over and actually do talk them through our budget without any materials in front of me and see what kinds of questions they have, see what things they didn't understand. So this is not a metaphor. It is an actual recommendation to explain your budget to a friend at lunch or over drinks. because that will force you to simplify. It will force you to craft a story that is easy to tell and, more importantly, easy for people to walk out with and understand. So that kind of that story that we want to tell, just to give you a sense, a little structure to that lunchtime conversation, is going to tell the overall context. Might be nice to tell some of the recent successes from the district, get people in a good mood, and to get them to appreciate all that the schools are doing. As I said, you would definitely talk about the biggest additions in spending. You would talk about the biggest reductions. You would not read them every line of their budget. I'm sure you'd talk about the taxes. And then weirdly enough, if you didn't talk about what is the budget's impact on central office, it's very likely they're going to ask you, like, hey, seems like you're having to trim some teachers, but what about the central office? Because that is the question that seems to come up all the time. And you would spend as much time explaining to them the why you made these decisions as what those decisions were. So my experience has been that very often school and district leaders do a really nice job explaining their budget casually. And then when they get into the more formal setting, there's a lot more data. There's a lot harder graphs and charts to read. And in a weird way, even though they're trying to share more detail, they're actually communicating less. So that's the first thought. It's about telling stories rather than just sharing numbers. And the best way to help hone and practice those stories is actually to tell them as a story without materials in front of you. That's thought number one. Tell your budget story, because that's what people can remember. Now, as you're telling your story, both formally or informally, we want to think about choosing your words carefully. And the reason we say this is there's been so much research done in the last 5 or so years. And what this kind of research is they've actually had one-way mirror conversations. And what a one-way mirror conversation is, they'll get an educator, a district leader, to be presenting a budget to a group of community members, and others are watching behind a one-way mirror, that presentation. And after the presentation, the presenter leaves, and then an interviewer comes in and starts interviewing the people who just heard that conversation, who just heard the budget presentation, and asks them a whole lot of questions about what did you like, what didn't you like, what did you understand? They actually quiz them to see whether they did understand. And one of the biggest takeaways from these one-way mirror conversations has been that as educators, and I include myself in this category, we often use words that seem so natural and normal to us, but they really seem to bother or confuse the wider audience. So we are unintentionally using words that confuse or bother a lot of people. And if you're confused or bothered, neither of those are a good place to be. So the first thing we just have to really work so hard at is removing jargon from our conversation. And I want to share with you words that as an educator, you probably use every single day. And the research has said, if we use these in a public setting, we will confuse more than half the group. RTI, MTSS, we know these are such important things for what we're funding, for the services we want to provide kids. Often a lot of our budget is in support of RTI and MTSS. We need to acknowledge that a large portion of people do not know what those words or letters stand for. SEL, I do know what that is, but much of your audience will not. Even something as basic as an IEP, when you're trying to explain that you've got more kids with special needs, that's why you're spending more. Many folks will say, hey, we've got more kids with IEPs. And a surprisingly large number of stakeholders do not know that means you have more kids in special education. Students with disabilities, another phrase that I use all the time. that generally conjures up in the minds of some of the public, kids in wheelchairs. And they're thinking, you're saying that 20% of the district are students with disabilities. And they're thinking, hey, I went to my kid's classroom. I didn't see anybody in a wheelchair. I didn't see anybody who was blind. They think we're exaggerating because what they picture as a student with a disability is entirely different from what we mean by students with disabilities. If we talk about kids going to out-of-district placements and that being expensive, so many people do not know, does this mean you're tuitioning kids to a high school, but don't we have our own high school? Are they going to a private school? Again, a term that comes up in many budget discussions, many budget presentations, but not actually understood by a lot of people. Instructional coaching or coaching, they're thinking the football coach, not a reading coach. Professional development, very misunderstood term. Behaviorist, an awful lot of people have no idea what they are and what they do or why you would want one. Behavior support services, 3 words that when you put them together mean almost nothing to a lot of stakeholders. MAP scores, and so on. You can get the sense, every one of these words, I suspect to every person on this call, you know exactly what these are. And these may not seem like really complicated words, but the research says that a large portion of your audience will not know what you are talking about when we use words like these. And the need to define these words or come up with alternative words for them that are in simpler English can really help get people to understand your message and understand your story. It is so hard for us who live with these words every day to even recognize that these are strange, that this is jargon. So one of the strategies I've used is I will actually write out a presentation or give a presentation to a small group of people who are not educators and ask them to highlight every single word that they are unsure of their meaning. And that is the way, part of this list got developed. But it's very hard to do this yourself because these words seem so basic to you. So there are other words that are also kind of problematic. It turns out that a lot of people do not like business lingo being put into an educational presentation. Now, this one really surprised me because I actually thought people did like this, like to say we're going to improve the productivity or have a better return on investment. Turns out that actually makes it feel like you don't love kids, that education is not a business. It actually makes people think, oh, you're just a money person. You're not a kid person. Now, I know you can be a kid person and care about money. But we really need to constantly be using and connecting every action to how it helps kids, not how it improves the return on investment or academic return on investment, a phrase I use and write about all the time. It does seem to make some people uncomfortable. And so we really want to talk about how these changes are going to help kids and avoid the business lingo. We live in a very strange time, but the word equity or social emotional learning, something that I believe most school systems in Vermont deeply care about. Some portion of your community, these political, whoops. Let's see, why did that stop share? People able to see my screen? Because I am not.
Yeah, we still see it.
Yes.
Okay, give me 10 seconds, folks, because I am not. Here
You just broke
Now
up
I
there
am.
for a minute, Nate. That's all.
Okay, so equity and social emotional learning, great ideas, words that really inflame some portion of most communities, and using words like we want fairness and we want to meet the mental health needs of our students. People really like fairness and they really want schools to address the mental health needs of kids. Now, for many of us, the picture on the left and the picture on the right are interchangeable, but for some in your community, they are not. Again, that they're not, a lot of folks do not want to hear about reallocation or doing more with less. Now, there will be a group that does like this. These are like the business people in your finance committee. They like this way of thinking, if I can overgeneralize. But again, it often comes across as uncaring. And if you're a parent, you don't want to do more with less. You don't want to reallocate. That just feels like you're not putting kids first. And reframing it to talk about that you're making very tough trade-offs. And that the key part here isn't just that you're making trade-offs, but you're acknowledging how tough these are. You don't want to do this, but we have to. We had to make some tough choices, and we wished we didn't. This one is, again, builds off the last one, this idea of being stoic about the cuts. And what I mean by being stoic about the cuts is presenting your budget as we had to do this. You know, our taxes can only go up by so much, or the community will only support such and such amount of spending. Often school and district leaders present their budget in a way that says, hey, we did the best we could. And that was my job as a leader. And that is your job. And you do have to live within constraints. But again, the way some people hear that is that you didn't care enough about kids. You don't appreciate how hard this is. You're being kind of cold about a very difficult and emotional thing. And so it is actually good and helpful to say that you feel bad about the cuts, to literally say, I feel terrible that we have a budget that had to reduce a reading teacher. I did not want to do that, but we had to make tough trade-offs, and to acknowledge that some of these changes will hurt. We're going to have larger reading groups, or we might not be able to help as many kids. Because let's face it, these cuts do hurt. They aren't great if you're having to make cuts. They're necessary, but they're not great. And people want to know that you know that. And you'll see in our budget template a number of places where we're going to encourage you to acknowledge how you're feeling about these cuts, how you're acknowledging that there are some downsides for either staff or for some kids, and then to explain why you had to do that, but don't skip over the part that is in fact difficult, unpleasant, and some kids and some adults may be in worse shape because of the budget. Another thing that for a consultant really bums me, but turns out that the world doesn't really care that much about research. When you say, hey, research says the science of reading is what our kids need, we want to invest in helping all our teachers become very strong in that. We do seem to be a bit of a time where we don't trust science. Where also lots of people are wondering, hey, that research, was that done in Massachusetts? Was that done in Texas? Because we're not Massachusetts and we're not Texas. So I'm not sure that research is really persuasive to me because I don't know enough about it. So it turns out it is more persuasive to say the research and our experience here in our district, in the Kennedy School, our teachers last month did X, Y, and Z. Last year, we rolled this out and our teachers saw student reading scores increase. Now, it's saying there's research behind it is nice, but saying that the experience of your own teachers and your own schools, that is much more persuasive to folks than just laying everything on a best practice or on a research report or John Hattie. So that's kind of the walking through some of the words and terms we might not want to use, the need to pick our words very carefully. So here I want to try, and maybe this we won't get good, maybe there won't be a lot of folks who can jump into this conversation. But again, QR code on the screen. Would love to know, for any of you who are in this session today, what strategies have you found to be effective to root out or avoid jargon for a budget presentation? Because this is hard. So I'm really hoping we can crowdsource some ideas, because I can't emphasize enough how much jargon audiences tell us we are using, even after we have tried very much to eliminate jargon. I see we got a few folks typing, which I appreciate. And if this technology works, we will start to see your answers when you are done. Oh, run the presentations through AI. I like that. I'd not thought of that, so I really do appreciate that. I think this idea of focusing on a story and using really simple language, not using abbreviations, that's certainly an easy thing to read through every slide you put together. And anytime you see an abbreviation, take it out. I really like that idea. Appreciate somebody is assigned the role of jargon buster. That is a great title. And hopefully you're in a place where you can really be on the watch for that. I have to admit, I used to think I could do that, but I think so deeply embedded in the world of education that I'm surprised at how much I miss. So I love having a jargon buster. It's definitely an important step. And to the extent you can even find a friend or a neighbor to be a jargon buster who has no educational background, that could be great as well. But really appreciate folks sharing those strategies. And again, remember we said the problem we have is that people did not understand our message. I know a lot of folks share that the #1 challenge is misinformation. Part of people having misinformation and part of people not knowing what we told them is if we use words they don't understand. So that I can't emphasize enough how important removing the jargon is. Great. Now, the last thing we want to talk about is building both trust and empathy. And again, in many budget presentations, there's a lot of emphasis on numbers, charts, graphs, calculations, but maybe not a lot of emotion. And but a budget is highly emotional for the people receiving the results of what's going to be in your budget. So building trust and empathy. I want to talk about this in a couple ways. So the first thing I want to point out, and again, this comes from real life stories that I have heard in Vermont. Also, I've heard elsewhere. But some of these examples I'm about to share of how people lose confidence in their leaders. And I want to say, right up front, I believe every superintendent, every chief academic officer, every principal, and every business official who is presenting part of a budget, they are 100% honest, they are trustworthy, and they are empathetic. So this is not a call to become more trustworthy or to become more empathetic, because I think you already are. But this is really a call for what do we have to do differently so that more people believe you are trustworthy and you are empathetic. And again, these examples I'm going to share have happened in recent times in Vermont by very smart, very caring people. Here is a phrase that makes people lose so much confidence. We cut the budget. Now, how is it that you can get in front of an audience and say, we cut the budget, which you did, and then people are thinking, whoa, this guy's a liar. I wouldn't trust a word Nate said. And here's the deal. When we say we cut the budget, many people look at our budget, and if last year was 20 million, and this year is $20,000,001. People say, that's not a cut. You just lied to us. Why are you lying to us? And you're thinking, last year we had 120 employees and now we have 110. 10 people are gone. We cut the budget. And they're saying you are spending more money now than before. And so it's really that we have incredibly different definitions of what the phrase or the word, we cut the budget. And being really clear about that if you're in most school budgets, even in the toughest of years, the actual amount of money you are spending is going to go up. Now, it didn't go up by as much as inflation. It may not have gone up enough to bring everybody back. But we really want to be very careful about these broad statements that we cut the budget. And what would have been a better statement to say is, while the budget went up by $1, inflation would have required $500,000 just to break even. And we used to have 120 staff, and now we have 110. So you definitely have reduced staff. You have not kept up with inflation, but you did not technically cut the budget. And that distinction, which may feel like I'm splitting hairs, there is so much research that says many in the public hear a statement like we cut the budget and believe we are being dishonest with them. Here's a phrase as well that I have used many times, and it came back to haunt me when I said, last year we cut 3 positions. Now you would think, like, that's such a clear statement, and I didn't mean to lie. We literally have 3 fewer positions in the budget. So I said last year we cut 3 positions. But what became the scuttlebutt was, whoa, Nate is lying. No one was fired. It's a small school system. We know no one lost their job. So how is it that we cut 3 positions and no one was fired? Well, here's how it happened. It happened one of 2 ways. We had 3 vacancies for the entire year, so we didn't carry them forward. And so technically, from a budgeting point of view, we did cut 3 positions. Or maybe we had 3 people who are leaving and we're not going to backfill them. That too is cutting 3 positions. But often people believe when they hear that we cut 3 positions, which is clearly a very tough and hard thing to do, that they're assuming somebody who worked at the district, who wants to work at the district, was let go. And so just being a lot more specific to say, hey, we had these 3 vacancies, we were unable to fill them because the job market's difficult, we're not going to fill them in the future, that saves us from the cost of those 3 positions. That is an honest statement that people don't question, that you're somehow trying to make things worse than they are, or somehow you're making this up. And this area of how many FTE you have in your budget versus how many FTE you actually have in your buildings is a place that often gets business officials and superintendents in a bit of hot water with folks. This is a very Vermont problem, but this is, that your funding is based on weighted students. You get more money for a high school student, you get more money for kids with special needs, for example. And so a superintendent, or I think this was a chief business official, at a presentation said, we are funded by the state for 1,000 students. And that is 100% accurate statement, that you are funded for 1,000 students. But even their own school board wanted to know why they were being lied to, because they know they only have 850 kids in the district. And the reason both are true, you have 850 humans who come to school every day. But the state funds you counting some kids as more than one. And just making that really clear, that the way the funding works and the number of students who are funded is not the same as how many actual human breathing kids come to school each day, is really important. because again, it may seem like a small distinction, but if people leave thinking you're lying about something as basic as how many kids are in the district, then they just don't know what else you might not be telling them the truth about. And again, you didn't lie, but what they heard felt dishonest to them. The last thing I want to share as we wrap this up is sometimes when we were presenting the budget, there's almost like a sense of like blaming the state or blaming inflation. Again, we're not trying to not own our decisions, but sometimes we say this in a fairly passive way that, and this is something I once said, we had to reduce mental health counselors and some electives at the school given the new funding formula. And basically what I'm saying is it's the new funding formula's fault, and there's nothing I could do about it. And that's a completely true statement. There's nothing I could do about it, and it was because of the funding formula. And so it seemed a reasonable thing to say, but what the one-way mirror conversations revealed is that it made people feel like we weren't taking responsibility, we weren't owning this, we weren't feeling bad about this. And so what we need to incorporate into this kind of decision is how much careful consideration we gave. We didn't do this willy-nilly. We didn't do this easily. We say the principals in central office considered 15 options, including A, B, C, X, Y, and Z. These are all the things we considered. And ultimately, we agreed, it wasn't just me, but we agreed that we could best meet the needs of our students by offering some electives every other year. That's the electives part. But we're really showing that it wasn't an easy decision, it wasn't a quick decision, and it wasn't a unilateral decision. And then people can appreciate this answer better. We also want to say that we're going to acknowledge the pain. And we should say right out loud, we know that our students need mental health counseling, and we've maintained some mental health services at each school, and we wish we could have kept more. I think sometimes we, and I know I did as a superintendent, when I would present a budget, I would try to justify that this was a good decision, and I hope they were, but I did not nearly enough share that it was also a really tough decision, that it wasn't a win-win. It was simply the best decision we could make, and we made it after a really careful and thoughtful process, but we still know it's not a great decision. It's just better than all the other decisions. So having that acknowledgement of the pain really helps people appreciate all the anguish that you went through to make that decision. So that is a relatively quick walk through the research on talking about the budget. Most importantly, again, if there's one big takeaway, two big takeaways, it's you're telling a story, and it's got to be a story without any jargon in it. Tomorrow, we're going to come back, and hopefully you will as well, to talk about how do you build support, getting more people, not angry from how we talk about it, but how do we get people to support your tougher decisions. And we will also share with you a very detailed budget template that incorporates all of these best practices. Lastly, if you do have questions, snap the QR code again, same one you got at the very beginning, and we will respond to your questions in writing and then share the answers with everybody as well. And with that, I hope that was helpful as you go through what is not an easy task of presenting the budget.